The current situation in the country when it comes to drought really paints a picture to a bigger disaster that we as a country or as a continent have not really managed. You might hear that we're taking steps, but then are we there? Because for how long then are we going to have conversations around drought management, hunger? Because currently in the country, as we start to look at business today, we do know that 4 million Kenyans are facing hunger and starvation. But then you ask yourself the question, we as the media, do we shout about this as much as we should? Have you seen current news that are really talking about the current drought situation in the country? How many programs about climate change and justice do you actually get to watch in a day in your mainstream media? That's where the question begins then. So today, we're talking about climate justice, and we want to look into a very specific area, the role of storytelling. Let me introduce the two beautiful guests who are joining us then to headline this conversation from that particular angle. We're joined by Sandra Subi, who's a visual and performing artist. Sandra, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How
Welcome
are you?
to Look at Business.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank you
to
very
have you
much.
around, isn't it? All right.
It's
We're
my
also
pleasure.
joined by Anna Gishuki, who's a communications and events curator. Anna, how are you doing?
I'm great.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's lay further background then into this conversation where we're looking at the role of storytelling in shaping the climate justice narrative for Africa. In the just concluded Climate Week for Africa conference in Gabon, participants outlined Africa's objectives for the upcoming COP 2027 in Egypt to unify and amplify the African voice to ensure action. Now, the reality is, though, that a lot has to be done amid calls for urgent action to safeguard the continent from climate change. Sandra, let me begin with you. You know, when we say the role of storytelling in climate change conversations, and then you introduce an artist into this conversation, even before we get to say exactly what your work around this has been, do you think that we need to use artists in as much as we can then to channel this conversation about climate change? Or we talk to the government, all right, let the governments deal with it. For us, we live in it.
Yeah. Well, most definitely. Artists have been defined as the eye of society.
Yes.
We have this very good and very great privilege to have the opportunity to look at things and study what we might consider as our normal, you know?
Yes.
And from that derive particular directions or opportunities or ways of seeing and thinking. And I think therefore then the response to your answer would be yes, you should invite artists into this conversation, because what they then do is that power of storytelling. They allow you to have access to someone else's story or their own particular story, for example. I remember in one of the conversations with one of our climate activists in Kampala, Uganda, called Vanessa Nakate. She was really highlighting how many times when you have this very big COP, you know, setups there, you have these people speaking and sharing all these written things. And she was saying, but the role of us as activists, which is sort of what we switched up as artists and said artivism, is that we get to really share what's happening on ground.
Yes.
And that many times, when you really look at it and oversee the whole conversation of 1.2, we need to get to 1.5, so we are okay with 1.2, really becomes a thing where you are not really finding out what's happening to the people on ground. And many times as Africans, let me say as Kenyan, I'm Ugandan, as a Ugandan, we are really in the spaces where the people who are causing the least, you know, influence to this conversation are facing the most harm.
Yes.
And so I believe as artists, because I'm a visual and performing artist, we have these two very powerful tools, art and music. And really that the role of what we do is really to tell the stories of the communities in which we are, of the things that we experience, of what we are seeing. And so for me, it has been a very interesting journey to learn what we are actually facing. I remember coming when I arrived yesterday, and the first conversation we had was with a gentleman called Willie, and he was driving me to where I was going to stay, and he said something. He said, do you know the weather in Kenya has changed? They told us that it's going to be cold up to August, but now we're entering October, and it's still happening. And for me, it was very powerful because it's almost like you pinch people, and they, even without knowing, they're speaking on the issue of climate change. And that's very powerful. And I think more and more, what art does is that it gets it out of the, it gets the story to a very personal level and individualizes it, and that brings a lot of ownership. Because then, if you look at my plastic sculptures, let's say, you're thinking, I also take water. I also use these plastic bottles. What else can I why is she making this outfit? Why is she walking in public space with it? And so I think it becomes a very personal question that then raises ownership for this thing, and that I believe then becomes very communal, because the more individual this conversation becomes, the more it becomes something that I'm sharing with Anne, that I'm sharing with you as Elijah, and at the end of it all, even with the people that are watching right now, it really settles into, like, in my home, in my life, what how has climate justice or how has climate change affected me and those around me, and how can I be a person that's really affecting change towards climate justice.
Pretty much. I'll be coming to you, Sandra, on that as well. Anna, let me rope you into the conversation. I was speaking to Sandra off air, and she said, when people talk about climate justice, it sounds something huge, like something that is on a personal conversation. For someone who wants to understand what climate justice is, how would you tell them what climate justice is? Let's begin from that.
What is climate justice? I would say it's definitely, we have a lot of really crucial things happening in the world right now. When you think about weather extremes, either it's very hot and very dry, like we saw this past summer in Europe, or it's flooding, like we've seen in India, or it's cold and dry, like we've seen here in Nairobi. Climate justice, I would say, is taking that stand as an individual, as a corporation, as a country, and saying, this is what we want, this is what we want to do. We don't want to, the things that are pulling down our climate, we're against that. We're standing up for that. That's what I would define climate justice as. Yeah.
And from your perspective as well, when we're talking about the upcoming COP27, again, somebody was asked, who's COP27 and what we're talking about these climate events? Would you decipher for us why some of these events are quite important, especially when we're talking about climate change and justice for climate?
Right. I'd say when we come across these events like COP27 or Climate Story Lab Africa, which is coming up next week, I think the importance of those events is to really have these conversations with people on the ground. A lot of the time when you hear about climate conversations, you're hearing about people at the UN in New York, 5 countries sit down and decide what's happening with the whole world. I don't think that's very fair. I don't think that's a lot of justice. So these conferences like these bring that conversation down to the people here on the ground, people who actually get affected, the farmers who are actually finding it hard to reap a harvest, or the school children who can't go to school because of floods. Yeah.
It's interesting you're mentioning that as well, like this climate lab that is upcoming. I want us to talk about that just a little bit more. As an event organizer, and you want to bring people on board, or part and parcel, the ones who receive this first impact of climate change, what are we looking forward to seeing at a climate lab, and why are we going to see these people there?
So at the Climate Story Lab, we have some panels that we've curated with professionals in the energy field, in the farming field, people who do a lot of the deciphering of the big words and the big documents around climate justice. So they're going to be a part of the Climate Story Lab. But also, because it is a story lab, we're going to be including a lot of storytellers. We have a few filmmakers from Sierra Leone, from Benin. We have Sandra Subi here from Uganda.
Yes.
We have a very enterprising young lady from Kenya who's built a board game around climate justice. We're also going to be incorporating a lot of other artists. We have a fashion installation, a climate justice fashion installation we're going to have. We have performances, because these are the people who are here on the ground with us in Africa who are actually doing something. They're not waiting to hear what those 5 countries in New York have decided before they feel like they can get up and do something or make their voices heard.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I'll be coming back to you on some of the stories we've actually been able to see over time. Sandra, again, the art of storytelling, I want to come back to that as well. You're an artist, by the way, you're not even Kenyan, but now there's an event that you're doing here in Kenya that's coming up as well. Does that make this conversation about climate a universal conversation? And do you think artists like you are the ones who can make this conversation universal? And just before we went on air, I did ask you, Sandra, that so when it comes to entertainment, visual arts and performance, yes, we've delinked artists from activism, you will say.
Yeah.
Does that climate activism make it easier for you as an artist to appeal? Because I know, Sandra, you may want to appeal to a lot of people. And so here is an artist talking about climate change.
Yeah.
Does that sort of put you in a different position than you would want?
That's a very good question. Let me see if I can break down what you asked. I think that most definitely, music and art are universal. I don't think whether you, like, it's almost like it's a language that we all speak. You don't have to, I don't know, you don't even have to add anything to it. As they are. So for me, I always say this as I have a privilege. It's a privilege, to be able to practice in both spaces. I have seen very much that, number one, for me, being able to speak about or to share the work that I've been doing in Uganda, and it's still relevant here, is a very big message in its own right. And I think that I can't claim to say, is it or isn't it, but I think the responses that I'm getting get to show that, because I remember we were speaking with, and as I was coming, and I was talking about some of the material that I've used to make some of the wearable art that I make. And we would keep talking, it's like, yeah, we have that material here, you know? And I think that then this material allows for it's almost like you start the conversation, but even if you got out of it, it's almost like you almost highlighted something that people wanted to speak about, that wanted to respond to, and really just gave them an avenue to have that conversation in a way that wasn't. I was telling you before that sometimes when you speak on climate justice, it feels like a blame game, you know? Who did that? Who did, you know? But as Anne said, it's that people are really facing this thing. Like, for Willie, as he was driving me, he's like, even as I entered, like, it's so cold, you know? And coming from a very warm Kampala, I'm just like, what is happening? And you know, already he has a response. He didn't have to read about it. He didn't have to be told about. He's really experiencing it. And so, I think that yes, when you ask, it is universal. It is universal. And it is almost like a conversation from heart to heart. It is very individual. And many times when things are individual, when we come together and it's something we are all experiencing, it becomes very communal. And now it's crossing boundaries. I really, and yet even to that point, as Anne mentioned, we are not having enough conversations on climate justice, you know? And so I think that yes, it is a universal tool. I also think that it's a very, if we had a lot more of it, there would be a lot more awareness, because as much as this is a very communal or something that we need to deal with, yes, there are people that make the decisions, but the people, the individuals have the power to influence the people that lead them. So if you allow them to put language or to be able to communicate what it is they're experiencing, I think that then that becomes very global. And if we had a song in Kenya, a song in Uganda, and you know, and all these songs are on platforms whereby people are listening and saying, yeah, in my my song, I sing something and say, speak up for your land, speak up for your future. We must take a stand, each one playing their part, as one raising their voice. We need to go green and do more. But you know, it's in song. Let me try to sing it so that you see. Then it you know, it's like when I speak, you're like, yeah, okay, that conversation. When I sing it, you're like, so it says, speak up for the land. Speak up for your future. We must take a stand, each one playing their part, as one raising their voice. We need to go green and do more, for this earth is our only home. Go green right now. Chidagala, chidagala. That's a Luganda word that says go green. Chitwagalo kulagula. And many times you move into these spaces, you sing this song, you're wearing the sculpture that you're wearing.
Yes.
And people really understand it, you know? And in a way, you've almost removed the boundaries to knowledge. You've removed the boundaries to who should know, who should take a stand. And you know, this whole conversation sometimes of, that's their role, not my role, you know? And I think it just makes it very individual, very personal. And it's really, as the artist saying, this is what I've seen, this is what I've experienced, this is what I'm doing about it. And inevitably, it's almost like, and it's like, oh, what can I do about it?
Yes.
You're like, what can you do about
Yes.
it? And at the end, we can't all make, like, you know, very individual steps, but at the end, they compound, you know? And so right now, we're on Look Up TV, and we're speaking to an audience of people, and they too are asking themselves, what can I do about it? That's because you're bringing what you can, she's bringing what you can. We have this Climate Story Lab that's bringing all these stories together that at the end, I believe, compound and speak to something deeper than, oh yeah, this thing is happening. Oh yeah. But more to, you know, this is my experience.
Yes.
And you might have experienced it too, but did not know that that's what you are experiencing. And I think that's the universal power of music and art.
Sandra, I'll be coming back to you then, because somebody would ask then, you know, you find yourself in this interesting space. Are you at a personal level find yourself championing for climate justice? And let me cross over to you as well. So you've got to recognize that all of us here are young people, and we're recognizing that indeed, if we're going to talk about climate justice, then it's got to be for us and for the future. Even the older guys are already out of this conversation, by the way. About this Climate Story Lab that you're going to have as well, are you specifically targeting young people? And over this period that you've been sampling these stories and saying, well, these are the stories that I think could motivate action. Have you seen any action from some of the stories that you've actually brought up through your events?
That's a very good question. So I came on to the Climate Story Lab this year.
Yes.
As a co-curator for their fashion installation. But I was on the periphery of last year's event, the 2021 event, and there were some stories that we highlighted then that we'll be talking about this year to see how far they've come. Aside from that, I'm the communications manager at an organization called DocuBox, and what we do is we support East African filmmakers to tell the stories they want to tell. One particular film that we supported is called Thank You for the Rain. It's about, it follows the protagonist and director. His name is Kisilu Musia, and he's just a regular farmer from Mutomo County, Mutomo in Kitui County. And the premise of the story is that he began filming his village when they faced, first of all, heavy drought and then heavy floods. And he began to tell his village mates, guys, this is climate change. And they were like, what's that? What's climate change? And as the story progresses, you see Kisilu ending up at COP23 in Paris, talking about there's my villages, people don't have water, people are dying, or animals are dying. This is my story from Kenya. I want to share my story. And from that film, now there was an earth dam that was built in his village. Yeah, that I think it watches about 100 families.
Yes.
So these stories do go forward, and they do create lasting impact.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which stories are you going to focus on mostly in this year's event? And you know, the could be stories of the effects of climate change. Like if you want now, and I mean, it will take a second for us to see the devastation that is happening at the northern part of Kenya. I mean, that's the story that is told.
Yeah.
And then, are you concerned on a personal level that these stories are not being told enough? Even right now in Kenya, there are concerns that some of these stories are getting swept under the carpet. We are not crying enough about climate justice in this country. Would you say that?
I would say that. I would say that there's definitely people like Sandra in the region, and when there's so many other Sandras even here in Kenya who are saying something about the climate justice, but I still think we have some ways to go in terms of how many are we telling this story.
That's it, isn't it?
Yeah, but even just the individuals, even just you having us on the show, I think that's already a really big start.
Yeah. All right, Sandra, let's then talk about you now, because it's a personal conversation. I find you in a very interesting space. Here you are, you're not just performing entertainment, which you don't have to live by that code. You're in a place where you're talking about climate justice, climate change. Have you, in your personal level, found yourself as an activist right now? And what influence do you talk to me about in terms of the responses that you've got so far?
Wow, yes, I have found myself in that position. I think that when you start speaking about something that really touches people and is actually affecting them, you somehow, yes, do find. But I've also given myself to learn. I'm constantly saying that I am very aware of what's happening around me, and I am alert to be a learner, because, sometimes we think we know things, but we do not know, And I think for me, one of the great privileges of my practice is to be able to learn, to listen to others and learn, and many times incorporate what I'm learning into what I'm then creating. Yes, so I think it has somehow pushed me to look at that. We are here, and we're speaking. Most times you'd find artists in galleries showing our work, speaking about what has inspired us. And so it's very interesting that when you're, what's inspiring you are some of these things. For me, it really also came from the material that I was using, and really the conversation for me was, as an artist, these things were available. They were here. Every day, like I walk just a little bit, there's a plastic bottle. I walk a bit, there's a plastic bag. And I started thinking, why aren't we using this as material? Why isn't this like a medium in which we work? And from starting to work with that, really started to be enlightened on why is this material there? Who actually puts it there? I think I also use it, and when I use it, what happens to it after that? And then the fact that it's not biodegradable, like consistently learning, and then learning that it's really becoming somehow like ingrained into our, material culture. Someone actually mentioned that plastic is almost becoming like a god of materials, because wherever you go, there it is. And sometimes you can think, this material is here. It's always here. Yeah, it's framing our cameras. It's probably making some of our clothes. And we're just like, that's life. But no, I think it's important. And what is the role of the work that we are then doing with Climate Story Lab, and all this music and activism, as you called it, is that then you're really highlighting the issue, You're highlighting it in a very fluid, a very organic, a very true way that people are experiencing, and you're giving them the chance to respond and say, oh, is that what it is? I think when you say then, what responses have I got? For example, we are here and we are sharing a story from Kampala. That's a response, on a platform in Nairobi. I think that's very powerful.
Pretty much.
Because then that means it's something you're also facing. Number one, I have had moments when I go and I'm doing these processions and the children come because they're attracted with visually what are they seeing, But then they're also wondering, what is it about? How did you make it? You mean I can also make something? I do some sessions called Dream Labs where we really task the people in the community to collect whatever it is they have, and we come and repurpose it into something that will be of use in their home, in their lives, a symbol, a functional object. And for me, it's just very, very enlightening on how powerful what it is that, you know, like how powerful music and art is. So yes, I think it pushes me. I did not intend to become an activist, but I have learned that there's a way to use art as activism, you know, music as activism. And so yeah, I'm on that journey of learning. I'm on that journey of consistently sharing and listening and sharing to, I guess, many times if you see some of the work that I make, I was also telling Anne that it's not very complicated. And the goal of that is that if anyone sees it, they could also attempt to make it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Guys, I mean, we can't have any other time for these conversations. Guess what? I promise I will come.
For Climate Story Lab?
Definitely.
Okay.
I'll come over and then
He
after
can
that
also
we
tune in online, right?
Oh yeah?
No, he's gonna be there physically.
I'm gonna be there physically.
Okay.
Guess what? I'll come over so that we have these conversations on a deep level. Yes, Sandra, and I 30 minutes is not enough.
Yeah.
I'm actually starting to see it right now.
Yeah.
Guess what? I'll join you. I promise, and I'll be there. We'll carry over this conversation so that we can see now the actual impact. These stories, what are they doing on the ground? Now, remember, you can also be a part of that. Any questions that you have, I know they've come in at Lookup TV across all your social media platforms. I'll be forwarding them to them directly so they can actually get to respond to some of them. Do you want to attend as well? Anne is right here. I'll answer those questions. In fact, Anne, I'll be asking for that poster so we can get it to run it from our station as well. Guess what? I'll see you tomorrow for another episode. This is Look at Business. Guys, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having us.
It was fantastic.